The diary was found first. Not the object, the diary. It surfaced in a box of family papers passed down through a branch of relatives who had no idea what they were holding. A woman's handwriting, dated 1891, describing something her husband found in a field, something that didn't belong there. She never says what it was. She only says what she did with it. She buried it. And she asked in the same entry that nobody go looking for it again. 63 years later, someone did. This is the story of what he found, why she hid it in the first place, and how much of it we can actually stand behind, because that's the part most stories like this skip. If you want the kind of story that shows its work instead of just handing you a bow-tied ending, stay with this one. Subscribe to Black Oak, because the trail this diary leaves behind goes further than one field, one family, or one buried object. Her name was Eliza Marsh, 26 years old in the spring of 1891. Married 4 years to a farmer named Josiah. Living on 60 acres of hill ground outside a small Vermont town we're calling Thorn Hollow. A church, a mill, a general store, a scattering of farms climbing the slopes above a creek that flooded every April and froze every December. Eliza kept a diary the way a lot of farm wives of her generation did. Not literature. Bookkeeping for the soul. Weather. Chores. Illness. The price of butter. Most entries run a line or two. Some days she wrote nothing at all, which is part of why the entry from May the 14th stands out. It runs to nearly a full page, 3-4 times the length of anything around it, and the handwriting changes partway through. It starts even and careful the way she wrote every other day. By the end, the letters are pressed hard into the paper, some words underlined twice. She begins with an ordinary morning. Josiah went out before sunrise to clear stone from the north field, the same rocky slope he'd been fighting all spring. Vermont hill farms are notorious for it. Every winter the frost pushes new stone up through the soil, and every spring the farmer digs it back out, an endless argument between man and ground. Around mid-morning, Josiah came back to the house early. That alone was unusual. He didn't stop work early, rain or shine, unless something was wrong. He told her he'd struck something with the plow that wasn't stone. She describes him as pale, not injured, not frightened the way a man is frightened by an animal or a fall. She reaches for a different word, unsettled. He walks her out to see it. She describes that walk almost as carefully as she describes the object itself, which is unusual for a diary otherwise built on economy of language. The plowed furrow ran the length of the slope, dark and wet from the morning's work, and near its center the earth had been broken open in a way she calls unnatural, a word she doesn't use anywhere else in 6 years of diary keeping. The plow itself had been knocked sideways hard enough to bend one of its iron teeth, which she takes as evidence of how firmly the object had been seated rather than sitting loose near the surface. That detail, a bent plow tooth, is easy to skip past. But it's the kind of thing a woman inventing a story wouldn't necessarily think to include. It isn't dramatic. It's a blacksmith bill and a delay in spring planting, the sort of mundane damage a farm family remembers precisely because it was inconvenient, regardless of what caused it. What follows is the part that has kept people arguing about this diary. She describes an object roughly the size of a bread loaf, dark, smoother than anything that should have been sitting under Vermont topsoil. Not stone, not metal in any way she recognized, though metal is the closest comparison she reaches for. She notes it was warm to the touch on a cool spring morning. One sentence, no elaboration, and she moves straight on to describing markings on its surface. Not letters she knew, not any alphabet she'd seen in a Bible or a ledger or a gravestone. Lines that seem to run in patterns, she writes, like something drawn on purpose rather than worn by weather. And she writes one more detail worth holding on to. The object had clearly been buried a long time. Deep enough that Josiah's plow, which normally turns soil 6 or 8 inches down, had struck it well below that. Which raises a question Eliza herself never answers on paper. If it was buried that deep, who put it there? And when, since the field had only been cleared for farming decades earlier, well within living memory of the town? She doesn't speculate. What she writes instead is a decision. they were not going to tell anyone in Thorn Hollow. She gives a brief, almost defensive reason. That strange talk travels faster than sense in a small town, and she didn't want the object or strangers connected to their family name. So instead of reporting it, they wrapped it in oilcloth, placed it inside an old lead-lined tea chest that had belonged to Josiah's mother, and buried it themselves, not back in the field, but somewhere closer to the house, left deliberately vague. A woman who recorded the price of eggs to the penny chose not to record where her husband buried something the size of a loaf of bread. That's not an accident. That's a decision. The entry ends with a line that reads less like a diary and more like an instruction. Let no one dig for it. What's buried should stay buried. For a rural New England diary from 1891, that's unusual enough on its own. It gets more unusual when you look at what happens afterward. Because Eliza kept writing for another 6 years, and she never mentions the object again. Not once. No follow-up thought, no confession that she'd changed her mind or told a friend after all. The subject closes on May the 14th and stays closed. That kind of silence is its own kind of evidence, even if it's evidence we can't fully interpret. We don't get to know why she went quiet. We only know that she did, deliberately, for the rest of the time she kept that book. There's a second thread from the same period worth noting briefly. Church membership records from the period show the Marsh family stopped attending Sunday service for roughly 4 months, starting in late May of 1891, resuming that fall with no explanation recorded. In a town the size of Thorn Hollow, an absence like that wouldn't have gone unnoticed by the rest of the congregation. It could mean any number of ordinary things: illness, a hard planting season, a family disagreement. The timing sits close enough to the diary entry that it's worth including here rather than leaving out. It isn't proof of anything on its own. Josiah Marsh died in 1911. Cause of death recorded simply as lung complaint, one of the most common phrases in Vermont town books of the era, covering everything from chronic bronchitis to advanced tuberculosis to decades of hard labor in a cold climate. Nothing in the record connects it to 1891, and we're not going to manufacture that connection for the sake of a better ending. Eliza outlived him by 15 years, dying in 1926. The farm passed to relatives with no interest in hill farming, changed hands twice more, and sat mostly empty through the Depression. By the early 1950s, the old farmhouse was, by every local account, a wreck, roof partly collapsed. Barn long gone, the kind of property that shows up in a tax sale because nobody wants to maintain it and nobody wants to tear it down either. In 1952, a man named Walter Pruitt bought it. 34 years old, a Korean War veteran recently discharged, looking for cheap land close enough to Thorn Hollow to commute to a lumber mill. He wasn't buying history. He was buying a roof he could rebuild and land he could eventually farm at a price a returning veteran could actually afford. He'd never heard of Eliza Marsh. As far as anyone can tell, in 1952, almost nobody had. The diary had left the family decades earlier, sitting in a trunk in a house nowhere near Thorn Hollow, waiting for someone to go through it. Pruitt spent 1952 and most of 1953 patching the roof, rebuilding a collapsed wall, clearing 20 years of brush. In the fall of 1954, he turned to the old spring house, the small stone structure built over a natural spring that farms like this one used before refrigeration to keep dairy and produce cool. Half collapsed, its wooden floor rotted through in places, the stone foundation still mostly intact. He meant to either restore it or clear it for something new. Either way, the floor had to come out. By his own later account, one section of floor didn't lift the way the others had. It resisted, then cracked, and gave way all at once. And what came up with it wasn't just rotted wood, it was wood that had been built around something. Beneath it, in a shallow pit lined with flat stones, was a chest, roughly breadbox-sized, wood gone soft and grey, metal fittings rusted nearly solid. He pried it open, expecting tools or coins or nothing. What he found inside, wrapped in cloth that fell apart at a touch, was an object roughly the size of a loaf of bread. Dark, smooth, marked with lines that didn't resemble any writing he recognized. He had no way yet to connect it to anything. He kept it on a shelf in his workshop, mentioned it to a few neighbors as a curiosity, and mostly forgot about it as the renovation took over his time. By every account from people who knew him, he wasn't a man given to exaggeration. which makes his account worth taking seriously. Though it isn't, on its own, proof of anything, one more physical detail is worth keeping. The stones lining that pit were fitted with more care than a hasty burial job needs, and town occupation records list Eliza Marsh occasionally working seasonally as a stonemason. A plausible connection, not a confirmed one. Here's where this stops being two separate curiosities and starts being one thread. So before we get to how those two threads finally crossed, if you've ever come across something in an old family box that nobody could quite explain, that's exactly the itch this channel exists to scratch. Hit subscribe now, because the next part of this story is the part that actually ties it together. It would be nearly a decade before anyone made the connection, and it didn't happen quickly. Around 1961, a great-niece of Eliza's, a woman with a background in local genealogical research, was cataloguing a box of inherited family papers and read through the diary for the first time. She noticed the May 1891 entry for the same reason you'd notice it. It didn't match anything else in the book, and it ended on a line that read less like a private thought and more like a warning left for whoever found it next. She wasn't looking for a mystery. Her background was in getting names and dates right for people tracing their family lines, which is worth mentioning because it means the person who first connected this diary to anything was trained to be skeptical of exactly the kind of leap she was about to make. She mentioned the entry to a few people out of curiosity, and one of them happened to know that the man who'd bought the old Marsh farm kept some strange object in his workshop that he liked to show visitors. That connection was thin. A diary entry from 1891, a rumor about an object from 1954, nothing tying them together except a shared piece of land, and it could easily have been two unrelated stories coincidentally sharing an address. In 1963, she visited, bringing a copy of the diary entry with her. He read it first. Then he went and got the object off the shelf. Dark. Roughly loaf-sized. Warm, he said, though by then he'd mostly stopped mentioning that detail to people because nobody believed him, and it was easier not to explain it. Marked with lines that ran in patterns rather than random scratches. It matched, not vaguely but specifically, in nearly every detail Eliza had bothered to record 72 years earlier. That's the most careful way to put it, and it's the important distinction. The object matched the description. That's a striking correspondence between two accounts separated by 6 decades and two people who never met. It isn't proof they're the same object. We can say the description lines up in detail after detail. We can't call that confirmation, and the story doesn't need to overclaim to be worth telling. A short item ran in a regional Vermont paper in early 1964, a few paragraphs between church notices and farm equipment listings. It generated some letters to the editor and a handful of curious visitors, most of whom Pruitt turned away. It never became a regional sensation. Fawn Hollow, by 1964, had fewer than 400 people, and most of them treated it the way small towns treat most strange things, with curiosity, a little skepticism, and no real appetite for letting it define the place. Matching the description answers one question and opens several more. If this is the object from the field, why move it to the spring house instead of just reburying it where it was found? One reasonable, unproven possibility: spring house foundations were often the driest, most stable ground on a farm. Built on bedrock specifically because the structure needed to last, a practical answer if Josiah and Eliza wanted it somewhere that wouldn't wash out or shift with the frost. That's speculation that fits the evidence. It isn't proven by it. The harder question is why Eliza wrote clearly enough to describe the object in detail, and specifically enough to note its unusual depth, yet stayed deliberately vague about exactly where they reburied it. If she wanted the story gone entirely, the simplest choice was writing nothing at all. Instead, she left just enough. Enough that, 70 years later, someone holding both the diary and the object could confirm they belonged to the same story. Whether that was intentional or just an honest diary keeper unable to leave the day unrecorded, we can't say with certainty. In 1964, the great-niece contacted a geology department at Vermont University, asking whether anyone would examine the object. A professor agreed on the condition the family understood the result might be entirely mundane, which is itself worth noting, because it's the ordinary, responsible way this kind of inquiry usually goes. The early findings raise more questions than they settled. The object resisted standard scratch and hardness testing in ways the examining notes described as inconsistent with anything in the department's reference collection. Under magnification, the surface markings were described as more consistent with intentional tooling than natural fracture or weathering, though the notes are careful not to claim certainty either way. Two explanations stayed on the table, and both deserve equal weight rather than a favorite. The geological explanation, an unusual mineral or meteorite fragment, outside the department's existing reference samples. Vermont has a real, if uncommon, history of meteorite finds, and this was considered at the time the statistically likelier answer for anything unidentified pulled off a farm. The manufactured explanation, tooled by hand or by some process the department couldn't identify, its markings deliberate, harder to support. Also, harder to dismiss, since natural fracturing doesn't typically produce the kind of repeating, evenly spaced lines the notes describe. Neither could be confirmed with what the department had on hand in 1964, which is exactly why further testing was requested and the object sent out for external analysis in early 1965. The trail in that particular file goes quiet after that. What we have is a request for testing, a note that the sample had been sent out, and then nothing. The object, by Pruitt's account, came back to him roughly 18 months later. He said, in an interview given decades afterward, that he was never entirely certain it was the same one. That's not an accusation, it's an honest gap. University departments in the 1960s didn't always keep the same chain of custody records for objects submitted informally by private citizens that they would today. There's one more piece of this worth stating plainly, because it's the strongest, cleanest contradiction in the whole record. The university's own surviving files show an intake record for the object in 1964. They show no matching record of it ever being released. Pruitt insisted, consistently, across every interview he gave over more than 2 decades, that it came back to him around 1966 and sat in his workshop for the rest of his life. And multiple neighbors, independently, described seeing an object matching it on his shelf well into the 1970s. Both things are very likely true at once. A university department working with a citizen-submitted curiosity, rather than a formally accessioned artifact, simply not finishing its own paperwork when the object went back out the door. That happens more often in institutional records than any deliberate withholding would require. It's still the kind of gap that makes you wonder what else in that file never got written down, and whether the results of that further testing were ever finished at all. Pruitt kept the object for the rest of his life. He died in 1988. What happened to it after that is the least documented part of this entire account. Family members interviewed later gave differing stories. One recalled it in a box of his personal effects. Another recalled it sold at an estate sale shortly after his death. No buyer from that sale has ever come forward. No museum or university collection in the region lists anything matching its description. The spring house itself was torn down years later during a renovation, its foundation cleared to make way for a garage. Whoever cleared it found nothing else underneath. Here's the honest shape of what's left. Established, Eliza Marsh's 1891 entry exists and describes a specific discovery, its physical details, and a deliberate decision to hide and conceal it. Walter Pruitt's 1954 discovery, in the same general location on the same property, matches that description in specific, unusual detail. Shape, size, color, the surface markings, and a reported warmth that both of them, decades apart, felt was worth a single offhand sentence and nothing more. A university examination in 1964 could not identify the material through standard testing and noted markings consistent with intentional tooling, without ever reaching a firm conclusion. Not established who buried the object originally, or when, since it predates the field being cleared for farming at all. What the further 1965 testing actually found, or whether it was ever finished. Where the object is today, or whether it still exists, that's not a solved mystery. It's a confirmed correspondence between two accounts, 63 years apart, given by two people who never met and had no reason to coordinate a story, sitting right next to a scientific record that never finished its own sentence. Eliza asked that nobody go looking. Somebody did anyway decades later, with no idea her warning existed, and what he found lined up with what she wrote closely enough that coincidence starts to feel like the harder explanation to believe. and not quite closely enough to call it proof. If a story like this one, built from what the record actually supports, gaps included, rather than a tidy answer handed to you at the end, is what keeps you watching, this isn't the only trail Black Oak has followed. There's another investigation waiting, another piece of evidence, somebody left behind for the right person to eventually find. Subscribe, and go see where that one leads.